July 19, 1945, the Sea of Japan. Before sunrise, the ocean was quiet. Too quiet for war. The water lay flat like dark glass, broken only by the shadow of a single submarine drifting beneath the mist. Her name was USS Barb, and she carried a crew of men who were about to attempt something no sailor in history had ever imagined. Inside the steel hull, red battle lamps glowed dimly over faces streaked with oil and exhaustion. They had spent months prowling the enemy's coast, hunting convoys and dodging depth charges, yet nothing they had done compared to what their captain had in mind tonight. Commander Eugene Fluckey, barely in his 30s, stood at the periscope, watching the faint outline of the Japanese coastline. He didn't speak for a long time. Then quietly he said the words that made every man on board forget to breathe. "We're going ashore." No one moved. Ashore? A submarine was built to fight from the sea, not on land. Yet Fluckey's calm tone left no doubt. The impossible wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Outside, a fog of gray hung over the surface. Beyond it lay the dark outline of Karafuto, northern Japan's rugged coast. Somewhere past those hills ran a single stretch of railway, the lifeline of supplies and soldiers moving between the islands. If that line could be broken, Japan's northern defenses would collapse overnight. But no plane could reach it, no ship could bombard it. Only a submarine could get close enough to strike unseen. In the control room, Chief Machinist's mate Billy Hatfield wiped grease from his hands and muttered, "Sir, you mean you want us to blow up a train?" Fluckey smiled faintly. Exactly. The idea was madness wrapped in logic. Submarines sank ships, not locomotives. But as the captain spread a chart across the navigation table, the plan began to take shape. Small, surgical, and suicidal. They would surface under cover of darkness, send a landing team of 8 men ashore in a rubber boat, and plant explosives beneath the railway tracks. The timing had to be perfect. The danger, absolute. A single mistake would bring the Japanese garrison down upon them before they could reach the water. The crew gathered around, listening as Fluckey laid it out. His voice never rose, but his eyes burned with the strange calm of someone who had already accepted the risk. "We've attacked everything on the sea," he said. "Now we'll hit them where they think they're safe." A hush fell over the room. Then one by one hands went up, volunteers. 8 men would go. No orders, no glory, just the chance to make history in a way no one else could imagine. Above them, waves slapped against the deck as the Barb surfaced through the mist. The moon broke through the clouds, painting the Pacific silver. The sound of diesel engines rumbled softly, masking the heartbeat of every man aboard. Fluckey climbed the conning tower and scanned the horizon. Somewhere in that darkness lay the railroad. Somewhere out there a train would soon carry Japanese troops to another battlefield, unless they stopped it first. He turned to his men. "Get the boat ready," he said simply. In the forward compartment, the volunteers packed their gear, demolition charges, a custom-made micro-switch detonator, and a timing fuse barely longer than a cigarette. They moved with quiet precision, each motion rehearsed a dozen times. None spoke of what might happen if they were caught. At 2300 hours, the hatch opened. Cold night air flooded in. The 8 men slipped into the rubber boat, paddles cutting silently through the water. The submarine drifted behind them, engines idle like a shadow watching its own heartbeat float away. For 10 agonizing minutes, they disappeared into the blackness toward the shore. No one aboard spoke. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. Then, through the fog, a single flashlight blinked twice, the prearranged signal. They had made it. Deep inside the Barb, Fluckey allowed himself a thin smile. "Good hunting," he whispered. Tonight, sailors had become saboteurs. Before that night when the Barb dared to creep toward Japan's northern shore, she had already lived 9 lives at sea. Her steel hull carried the marks of depth charges, near misses, and victories that would have broken lesser crews. But her true weapon was not her torpedoes. It was her commander's imagination. Eugene B. Fluckey was not the kind of officer who followed the book. Where others saw limits, he saw opportunities. Where others whispered impossible, he said, why not? Born in Washington, D.C., Fluckey had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1935, lean, sharp, and restless. He served on older submarines before the war, where routine was law and initiative was punished. But when the world caught fire in 1941, that restlessness became his greatest gift. He believed war was not only about orders, It was about outthinking the enemy, faster and bolder than they could imagine. By 1944, the war in the Pacific had turned desperate. American subs had strangled Japan's merchant fleet, but the enemy's coastlines were still alive with patrols, gunboats, and airfields. That was when Fluckey took command of USS Barb, SS-220, a sleek diesel-powered killer built for deep ocean warfare, not coastal raids. When he stepped aboard, morale was low. The crew had seen long patrols with little to show for it. Fluckey changed that in a single briefing. "We are not just hunters," he told them. "We are inventors." He ripped pages from the manual and pinned his own words on the wall. "We don't wait for opportunity. We make it." The Barb's next patrols became legendary. Instead of lurking in deep water, Fluckey took his submarine straight into enemy harbors, places other captains called suicide zones. In January 1945, he crept into Namquan Harbor, China, under the cover of night, sank an entire convoy at anchor, and escaped by skimming over a minefield at flank speed. It was a maneuver so daring that other officers refused to believe it had happened until they saw the photographs. For that mission, Fluckey received the Medal of Honor, but to him, the medal meant little compared to what it proved, that the enemy's safe zones were illusions. No fortress was unreachable, no coast untouchable. His men worshipped him not because he was fearless, but because he shared their risks. When torpedoes misfired, he was the first to reload. When depth charges rained down, he joked over the intercom to keep them calm. One sailor later said, "He made you believe you could do anything, even the impossible." And that belief spread like wildfire through the crew. They began to tinker with new ideas, mounting rockets on the deck, testing shore bombardments, designing homemade demolition tools. The Barb became a laboratory of war on the move. By mid-1945, the submarine had sunk more than 17 enemy ships and destroyed installations along the Chinese coast. But Fluckey was not satisfied. The war was nearly over. Japan cornered, yet his instincts told him there was still one more strike to make. Something symbolic. Something that would echo far beyond the tonnage of ships sunk. Then, during a routine reconnaissance through binoculars, he noticed something unusual along the coast of Karafuto. A railway hugging the cliffs, disappearing into the mountains, reappearing near the shoreline. He watched a train chug along it, small and insignificant against the rocks. But in that moment, an idea flashed like lightning. What if the enemy could be struck not at sea but on land, by a submarine? It was a thought so absurd that even he laughed at first, but the more he studied the maps, the more it made sense. The track was close enough to the water line that men could reach it from the beach. If they could plant an explosive beneath those rails and time it right, the next train would carry itself to destruction. He gathered his senior officers that evening. "Gentlemen," he said, spreading the map on the wardroom table, "we've sunk ships, harbors, and convoys. But what about something they'd never expect?" Silence. Then someone murmured, "You mean a train?" Fluckey's grin widened. "Exactly." The room erupted in disbelief, then nervous laughter. But as always, he had already solved the hardest part. How? He would send a landing party of 8 volunteers ashore under cover of night. They'd use a rubber boat to reach the coast, crawl to the tracks, and plant an explosive charge triggered by a pressure switch, a device that would detonate when the train's weight passed over it. The plan was simple in theory, suicidal in practice. One mistake, one patrol, one sound too loud, and they'd never make it back. Still, when he asked for volunteers, nearly every hand went up. The men of the Barb didn't want medals. They wanted to make history. That night, as the submarine drifted silently under the cold northern stars, Fluckey looked over the dark horizon and smiled. Let's give them a headline they'll never forget. It was then, in that quiet, daring moment, that the impossible began. Fluckey's plan required 3 things: courage, cunning, and a device delicate enough to hide beneath iron rails yet brutal enough to tear a locomotive apart. The first 2 the crew had in abundance. The third they would have to invent. In the days that followed, Barb's cramped workshops became a place of unlikely engineering. Chief Machinist's mate Billy Hatfield, whose hands could coax life from any twisted gear, sketched the detonator on a greasy mess table napkin. Hatfield's design was deceptively simple. a pressure-activated switch that would close a circuit when the heavy wheels of a passing locomotive depressed a small bearer board. The switch would trigger a battery-powered blasting cap, nothing more than a tiny spark, but placed under tons of iron at exactly the right moment. The spark would become calamity. They tested prototypes on the ship's deck, balancing wooden rails on barrels and rolling spare wheels across them until the mechanism responded reliably to weight. The men argued about timers and fail-safes, about insulating the circuit against rain and the salt air. "If this thing shorts early," one petty officer muttered, "we don't get a train, we get a funeral." But Hatfield's steady hands won out. He fashioned a micro-switch small enough to vanish beneath a sleeper and robust enough to endure the pounding of a passing freight. They wrapped it in oiled canvas and sealed the case against sea spray. For timing, they built a primitive fuse whose burn rate they could calibrate by length and composition. A cigarette's worth of delay, perhaps two. It was crude. It was beautiful. Next came the men. Fluckey didn't select by rank. He asked only for volunteers who could think under pressure and move like ghosts. Some came forward with the stoic eyes of men who had seen too much. Others were younger, cheeks smooth, hands unscarred. Among them were a torpedo man who had grown up on a Pennsylvania railroad and knew the rhythm of wheels by instinct, a quiet signalman with nimble fingers, a stout petty officer who could carry a crate like a mule, and Billy Hatfield himself, who had built the detonator and refused to let anyone else carry out the device he'd coaxed into life. They trained in silence. Under flares and against the shadowed silhouette of the Barb, the 8 rehearsed climbing into the inflatable, cutting across choppy water, and pulling the boat onto jagged rocks without making a sound. They practiced laying out planks, unspooling wire, sliding the switch into place, and sealing it with canvas. They timed each movement until the minute hand of the pocket watch felt like a tyrant. Any slip could attract a sentry's step, a dog's bark, or worse, the anguished howl of coastal searchlights sweeping like vengeful eyes. When the night came, the ship itself became a temple of hush. Engines idled. The men moved like shadows. Fluckey briefed the team once more in the wardroom. The map spread like a traitorous skin. He pointed at the coastline, then at a mark near a bend where, according to intelligence and his own careful observation, the track lay close enough to the water for a midnight party to reach it. "You'll land here," he said. "You'll move fast to the rail. You'll plant the switch beneath the sleeper. Time it for the overnight freight. Get back to the boat in 15 minutes. If you hear dogs, abort. If you're discovered, run fast. We'll be watching." They could see the logic and the risk. One man, a lanky seaman named Tommy Rhodes, swallowed hard. "Sir," he asked, "if we get pinned, what then?" Fluckey's face was a map of lines and resolve. "Then we fight like men who expect to win. But go thinking you'll come back. The mission depends on that belief." They left in pairs, 2 handling the detonator, 2 on lookout, 2 hauling gear, 2 to manage the boat. The inflatable slipped away, a dark crescent in a black sea. As the shore approached, each sound stretched into a threat. Waves hissed on rock. A distant dog barked and died away. Overhead, a single star shivered as if scared. The men pulled the rubber boat toward a pebble-strewn inlet, then grounded it with gloved hands. Bare feet found the cold, gritty shore. For a moment they stood listening, then moved. The path to the railway was a treacherous web of tidal pools and thorn bush. They hugged the cliff, hands scraping stone, eyes looking for the glint of patrolling boots. The moon slipped behind clouds, and their world contracted to the width of a breathing animal. Minutes became a slow, burning fuse. Out there, somewhere inland, the train's timetable ticked on, oblivious. They reached the track without incident. There it was, steel rails gleaming like a promise of disaster in the pale light. The sleepers were old, wood-soaked by rain and sea spray, but stable. It should have been impossible for wooden planks and a pocket-sized switch to stop a war engine, and yet that was precisely why the plan had been born, to prove that the improbable could be a tool in the hands of the bold. 2 men unrolled the clandestine kit. Hatfield's hands moved with surgical confidence. They pried a sleeper upward just enough to slip the micro-switch beneath the railhead. The device fit snugly and visible to casual inspection. Canvas-wrapped wire discreetly tunneled away and disguised among the dune grass. The men set the tiny blasting cap into place, checked the contacts, and then lit the fuse. A candle flame held like a sacrament. The spark would not touch until train weight depressed the switch. But the fuse was a backup. If the switch failed, the timed burn would still bring ruin. "You can't imagine what it feels like," one of them later said, "to put your hand on a thing that will tear a train apart and then walk away. It's like leaving a piece of yourself under the tracks." They left no footprints on the rails, only the small print of their resolve. The men retreated to the boat, every nerve a taut string. The sea received them like a patient bearer. The inflatable hugged the dark and the shore slid away like a secret. Back aboard the Barb, Fluckey watched the black line of horizon for signs of movement. Each minute that passed felt doubled in weight. The ship's logkeeper watched the clock. The ship hummed with expectation and a terrible tenderness. At 02:30 hours, the call came over the covert radio that the lookout had arranged to monitor, a distant low rumble, the train. It came as a shadow at first, a stretch of black moving with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Then, across the water, against the silhouette of Joseph's headland, the faint throb became a reality. Steel on rail, the ballast singing. The men held their breath. In the inflatable, the 8 stared at the dark shore, each of them carrying the knowledge of what they had set out to do. They watched a flicker of lights moving inland, the faint lanterns of a freight in the night. It was not a luxury express, but the heavy, dutiful rhythm of logistics, coal wagons, supply cars, a locomotive breathing steam like an animal in the dark. Down in the boat, Hatfield's watch ticked to a number they had rehearsed. The fuse would burn to near extinguishment. The pressure switch would do its work, and the train would become an instrument of its own end. The timing had to be flawless. Detonate too early, and the train might pass unaffected. Detonate too late, and the men might still be in the kill zone. When the locomotive reached the mark, wood and iron met with a sound that was like a final chord. The micro-switch felt the weight and closed the circuit. But at the same instant, the planner's contingency drew breath. The crew's backup fuse had to burn slow and true. And for one heart-stopping second, every man's life was held between a wet spark and a roaring maw of steel. Then the world answered with thunder. The explosion was not cinematic in the way films imagine. It was better, more terrible. The rails twisted like molten wire, timber splintered into a cloud of splinters, and the locomotive's heart, its boiler, erupted in a cataclysm of steam and iron. Carriages telescoped into each other. Flames leapt into the night and painted the cliff with orange. The sound rolled across the sea, a monstrous drum beat that rattled the submarine's hull like applause from the abyss. For a moment, the men in the boat thought the sky had fallen. The sea rocked with shock waves. On the Barb, sailors wept openly, not only for the violence they had unleashed, but for the miracle that a small mechanism and a handful of men had bent history's current for a single, blistering instant. Then the trained response took over. Check the boat, stow the gear, paddle hard. The 8 slipped away beneath the smoke and fear, hearts pounding against rib cages like frantic drums. The submarine, trained to the second, was already underway, moving into deeper water, putting distance between itself and the conflagration that would, in minutes, bring searchlights and shouts. They had done the impossible. The first shock of the blast still rolled across the black water when the 8 men felt the cold press of panic in their ears. From the shore came a new sound, the scream of human alarm, the frantic barking of dogs, the thin flare of searchlights stabbing at the smoke. They had seconds before every eye in the coastline's garrison would turn toward that smoking ruin. Paddles dug like oars of desperation. The inflatable bucked and slid over surf, the men hauling themselves toward the open sea with lungs burning and hearts hammering. Behind them, the railway lay in ruins, a wreck of iron and fire casting an orange glow into the heavy night. For a wild instant, the sea seemed to drink the light and hold it. Above them, someone on the Barb cursed and then laughed, the sound raw with relief. Fluckey's face from the conning tower was barely visible, a dark silhouette framed by the explosive glare. He watched the tiny boat retreat, counted heads, and then gave the signal. Engines coughed, reversed, slipped, and the submarine eased away under the smoke like a phantom melting into deeper black. But the raid was not yet finished. The night would now test every seam of their cunning. On shore, alarms spread like wildfire. Japanese sentries screamed orders in clipped voices. Lanterns bobbed like angry question marks. Men poured from outbuildings into the road, stumbling over cobbles, searching for the cause of the horror. Within minutes, artillery crews were alerted. Small craft cut loose from hidden coves. The railway that had been a vein of logistics had become a beacon of outrage. From the distance, a lookout on the Barb reported engine noises, small motorboats converging, hulls cutting the dark toward the cliff. Fluckey's jaw tensed. The sea would soon be filled with searchlights and whistles. The margin for escape was narrowing like a throat. He ordered the boat to make a feint. Two of his destroyer-sized illusions, minor maneuvers meant to draw attention, were executed. The inflatable slowed as if stranded, then kicked forward again, as if to tempt pursuers into thinking the raiders were still clinging to the shore. Meanwhile, the submarine put on speed, slipping beneath the waves to deeper water and executing a planned zigzag to break any sonar track. The plan relied on noise, smoke, and misdirection, all the things an island garrison could not calculate in the first panicked hour. From the cliff, Japanese searchlights stabbed the waves. Rifles cracked. A tracer streaked across the water like a comet with a purpose. The Navy boats, smaller and more maneuverable, skimmed toward the smoke. They would be the first to close the circle, and for a time it looked as if the men in the inflatable would be trapped in the teeth of that tightening ring. But Fluckey had gambled on one human weakness. In the chaos of night, people make wrong judgments. As the motorboat zigged toward what looked like a stricken craft, the submarine hauled under a current and slipped southward, deeper into the dark. The inflatables, now nearer the sub, drew behind a berm of reflected glare in the night's confusion, and the Barb's small diesel heart took them beyond the immediate sweep of the searchers. The nearby coastline erupted with flares. Men shouted. Dogs yelped. For a while the sea was a theater of frantic lights and sound. On deck, Fluckey barked orders. Trim the wake, bite the throttle, angle the screws, and the Barb obeyed like a living thing. The conning officer radioed for quiet. Below, the men kept still as stones, breathing slow to keep their lungs from giving them away. Japanese retaliation came in waves. First, motor launches rushed to the wreck, their crews searching for survivors or saboteurs. They found only twisted metal and scattered cargo. And then, in a sprawling sweep, the sound of the submarine's diesel engines receded, and the launches gave chase to nothing but a smudge on the horizon. Then came the bigger guns, coastal batteries alerted and opening fire into the dark sea. The rounds landed far from the Barb, their splashes angry and large, but none found iron. The Barb's crew had prepared for more than inflatables and switches. Fluckey executed a textbook of deception. The sub left behind a small smokescreen, oil logs and burning driftwood they had set alight near the wreck, to give the impression that enemy boats had returned to collect survivors. The Japanese, seizing on the wreck and smoke, committed men to a search that would hold them long enough for the submarine to vanish. At dawn, the coast was a smoldering bruise. From the Barb's periscope came the sight of small silhouettes scrambling along the shore, torches cutting at the ground. Japanese soldiers argued in harsh tones. Officers barked orders and tried to reconstruct the night's events. They would find fragments of steel and torn service flags, and the inference that something terrible had occurred. But they would not immediately suspect a submarine had dared to come ashore. That miscalculation was, in part, Fluckey's victory. Back on board, the men who had gone ashore were counted, and they cheered quietly, a raw, shaky sound that tasted of unspent fear. Billy Hatfield, the machinist who'd built the tiny device, had a smear of soot on his cheek and could not stop laughing with a sort of wonder. The others sat with their knees touching, holding each other's hands, eyes raw from the blast and the salt. "We did it," one gasped. It was truth and unbelief braided together. Word traveled up through higher command, through hushed cables, and then into the War Department's files. The raid would be reported with astonishment. The language would be tentative at first, incident and local action. But soon the truth would shape a tale of audacity that would travel beyond the confines of naval reports. For the Japanese, the aftermath meant more than a ruined train. The raid exposed a chink in coastal security that had been assumed impregnable. Patrols were doubled, searchlights circled like hungry insects. Coastal rail lines were inspected and guarded. For a time, convoys would route differently. Schedules would be rewritten, and every train that hugged the shore would move with an added caution that the sea had breathed a threat onto land. For the Barb and her crew, the strike remained a solemn triumph, proof that imagination could turn a tiny switch into a strategic blow. Yet even amid cheers and the relief of survival, there was a sober weight. Men had died in the wider war. Men had been shattered by the blast. The cost of such a show of power was always measured in human terms. They had altered supply lines and morale. But the night's echoes would still reverberate in the lives of those who had watched the orange blaze from the cliffs. As the submarine moved away from the shore and into the broader sweep of patrol routes, Fluckey allowed himself a look back. The coastline receded slowly, its fires failing like exhausted lungs. He thought, briefly, very briefly, about the men on the train whose lives had been swallowed in an instant. He did not speak of guilt. He only recorded it in the log as a mission accomplished, and in the quiet of his own thoughts as an act that war sometimes requires, precise, ugly, and necessary in the calculus of victory. At midday, neutral stations intercepted fragmented reports. Sailors on other decks leaned over oilcloth maps. For the crews, the Barb's act became legend before the ink had dried. The headlines would later call it daring, insane, and unprecedented. The Navy would classify it as one of those rare operations where the bounds between sea and land blurred. But for the men in the steel hull, returning to routine after such a fevered night was its own kind of silence. Depth charges still waited like cold thunder in enemy waters. Convoys still needed hunting. They would go on doing what they'd always done: hunt, evade, strike, only now with the knowledge that the sea could also reach inland, and the shore was for them a new frontier of possibility. By dawn, the Sea of Japan lay calm again. The fires on the coast still burned faintly, their smoke trailing upward like bruises on the horizon. Beneath that stillness, the USS Barb drifted silently, her crew running on adrenaline and disbelief. What they had done, what the world would soon learn, was something no one in the history of naval warfare had ever imagined. A submarine had destroyed a train. Inside the control room, the men were quiet. Even laughter had a strange edge to it, half relief, half wonder. Billy Hatfield, the machinist, sat cross-legged beside his toolbox, cradling the small wrench he'd used to assemble the detonator, his lucky charm now sanctified by success. "We actually did it," he murmured more to himself than anyone else. "We blew up a train." Fluckey allowed the words to hang in the air before answering softly. "And we made history doing it." The report he drafted that morning was almost absurd in its brevity. It contained no drama, no pride, and just the cold precision of fact. Landed party of 8 men. Planted demolition charge beneath railway track. Detonation successful. Observed destruction of 1 enemy train. All men returned safely. Those 23 words would echo through naval archives for decades. When they returned to base, news of the mission spread like wildfire. Officers who had served in submarines for years gathered around the Barb's crew in disbelief. Some thought it a joke, a sailor's exaggeration. But photographs, sketches, and physical evidence confirmed the truth. The wreckage of a Japanese locomotive, torn apart from beneath, left no room for doubt. Commander Eugene Fluckey became a legend overnight. The Navy, already in awe of his earlier raids, now recognized him as one of the most daring submarine captains in history. But when reporters asked how he planned such a reckless mission, he gave the same calm answer every time. "We didn't plan to be reckless. We planned to be right." He refused any extra medals, insisting the glory belonged to his men. The Navy eventually awarded battle stars and commendation ribbons to the entire crew. But on the Barb, there was no talk of ceremony. Only the quiet pride of knowing they had done what no one thought possible. The significance of that night went beyond the explosion itself. It changed how the Navy thought about submarines. Until then, they had been seen only as hunters of ships, creatures of the deep. But Fluckey's mission proved that imagination could turn a submarine into something far more, a platform for innovation, unpredictability, and psychological warfare. The message to Japan was simple and terrifying. Nowhere was safe. In Tokyo, intelligence officers refused to believe it at first. A train destroyed by what? A submarine? But reports from the Karafuto coast were undeniable. Locals spoke of an explosion that lit the night like sunrise, of strange footprints leading back to the sea. The shock spread through Japan's command structure like a cold wind. If submarines could strike on land, what came next? For the men of the Barb, the days after the raid blurred together. Repairs, debriefings, and the inevitable quiet that comes after the impossible. Some tried to sleep. Others couldn't. In the wardroom, Fluckey gathered them all for one final message. "Men," he said, "you've done something the world will talk about for 100 years. But remember this, my courage isn't about glory. It's about doing the right thing when no one else dares to try. There was a long silence, then a murmur of agreement. Someone raised a cup of coffee, the closest thing to a toasted sea. To the Barb, one said. Another added, to the crew. And Hatfield, ever the machinist, grinned and said, to the switch. Laughter rippled through the cramped steel chamber, echoing down the corridor and into the heart of the submarine. In the years that followed, the story of the Barb's raid became a legend in naval history. Fluckey retired with a chest full of medals and a heart still restless. When asked in interviews about his proudest moment, he didn't mention medals or records. He always went back to that night off Japan, the train, the 8 men, and the silence before the explosion. We didn't just destroy a train, he once said. We proved that imagination, courage, and teamwork could make the impossible real. He would live long enough to see submarines become nuclear-powered, their technology far beyond anything he'd known. Yet every time he was invited to speak at an academy or veterans gathering, he ended his talk the same way. Gentlemen, remember, the ocean rewards those who think differently. As for the USS Barb, she finished her final patrol and was later decommissioned, her name inscribed among the most decorated submarines in U.S. history. 12 war patrols, 96,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed, 1 harbor raided, and 1 train annihilated. When her ensign was lowered for the last time, veterans of her crew stood silently, their hands over hearts, eyes moist but proud. To the world, she was a warship. To them, she was something more. Proof that bravery could be engineered, and that the line between genius and madness sometimes leads straight to victory. Years later, when the war was only a memory carved into stone and metals, the story of the USS Barb became legend, whispered in classrooms, told at reunions, studied in war colleges. It was never just about a submarine or a train. It was about the rare moment when courage and creativity collided and changed the rules of war. For most, the ocean was a place of silence, a world where ships hunted ships, where men lived by sonar and died by depth charge. But for Commander Eugene Fluckey, the sea had always been more than water and waves. It was possibility. It was a canvas for ideas that others called madness. He believed that victory didn't come from strength alone. It came from imagination. When he spoke about that night in later years, his voice was still steady, still calm, the same tone that had carried his men through storms and fire. There are 2 kinds of sailors, he would say, those who follow the map, and those who make a new one. That line became a creed for generations of submariners who came after him. The Barb's mission was studied not only for its daring, but for its symbolism. A handful of men, armed with nothing but ingenuity and nerve, striking deep into enemy territory and coming back alive. In the measured language of history books, it was called the Karafuto train raid. But among sailors, it was simply known as the night the sea went ashore. In Japan, decades later, local villagers still spoke of the explosion with a kind of haunted awe. Some had lost family on that train. Others remembered the shockwave that rattled their homes. Yet even they acknowledged a strange respect for the men who had done it. They called it the strike that came from nowhere, a reminder that war in its chaos sometimes produces acts of genius that defy hatred itself. And so, history softened around the story. It became less about nations and more about people. The 8 men in a rubber boat, their breath misting in the cold. The machinist who built a switch by hand. The commander who believed in the power of imagination. And the train, a symbol of industrial certainty, undone by human will. Fluckey never saw himself as a hero. In his final years, when asked about the secret to leadership, he smiled and said, "Trust your crew. Give them a reason to believe in the impossible, and then stand back." He passed away peacefully long after the guns had fallen silent. At his funeral, submariners from across the world gathered, and one wreath bore a simple inscription, "For the man who made the sea dream bigger." Today, the name USS Barb is engraved on the walls of the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut. Visitors walk past her relics, photographs, logbooks, and a small rusted piece of railway track. That fragment of steel, twisted by an explosion half a world away, still carries the faint smell of salt and smoke. It stands not as a relic of destruction, but as proof that the human spirit, when unchained from fear, can turn even the unthinkable into history. And if you listen closely, In that quiet hall, you can almost hear the hum of the Pacific, the pulse of an engine beneath the waves, and the echo of a captain's voice saying, "We're going ashore." Because that night, the men of the Barb didn't just win a battle. They redefined what a submarine could be, what courage could mean, and what the word impossible would stand forever after.